All right, let's talk about these processing modes down here on the Fabfilter Pro Q. All right, so I'm just going to open a new iteration of this plugin just so I can mess with it and not mess up my mix here. But you might have noticed that we have these three options here on the Fabfilter Pro Q. So there's zero latency, natural phase, and linear phase. And you might have noticed that when you open up linear phase, you have these options: low, medium, high, very high, and maximum. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And you might have seen me, I tend to, let's see, here's how it starts. I tend to do this until I get to 7 bands, and then I swap it to natural phase. And that's kind of my default starting point for this plugin. So you might have seen me do that before. And before I get started, some of these things that we talk about today are going to be relevant to other EQ plugins as well. Things like linear phase, certain terms, they tend to apply to not just the Fabfilter Pro Q, but other EQ plugins as well. So let's start with zero latency here. So this is good for most applications according to Fabfilter. It's their most efficient processing mode and it has zero latency. That's kind of obvious, right? It's called zero latency. And basically what it does is it matches the magnitude response of analog EQing as much as possible. So that sounds pretty good, but let's move on to natural phase. So Fabfilter actually calls this mode better than the zero latency mode. They actually say, and I believe it's that it, quote, performs even better. So they're actually making some kind of a value judgment on it here, even though sometimes, depending on, we'll talk about this with the linear phase option, it's just a different tool for different uses, for different purposes. It's not inherently better or worse. But in their article about these different processing modes, which I will link to in my description, Fabfilter actually does call this better. They say it performs better than the zero latency. But, how is that, right? There's usually a give and take with some of these things. So one thing that they do say, the big takeaway, is that this mode matches both the magnitude and the phase response of analog EQ. So whereas with zero latency mode, it matches just the magnitude response of analog EQing, with natural phase, you're matching both the magnitude and phase response. They also say that there's no noticeable pre-ring, there's no long latency, right? So it's still good, it still sounds good. I'll put a link to the article with graphs and stuff that Fabfilter has in the description below so that you can see that if you want to learn more about this difference. But basically, they say that this delivers the best sound quality and the most accurate frequency response, even if you're using high Q settings and you're working in low frequencies. Okay, so now let's move on to linear phase here. So I'm actually going to click on this to open up these other options here, just because we're going to talk about what linear phase is and then also about these options that pop up with it. Okay, so like the name implies, linear phase works really hard to leave the phase untouched. So they're only changing the magnitude. They're trying to work really hard to avoid any phase issues. So this is a great mode to use if you're worried about phase issues, but it can introduce things like latency and pre-ringing, and you can sometimes lose transients with it too. It can either diminish or lose those transients. So we've already mentioned the ideas of magnitude and phase here, right? But it's good before we dig into it more to understand that different frequencies when you're using an EQ will behave differently and have different phase changes. And that can be either good or bad. It depends on what your goal is, what you're doing, all that stuff. I know I'm always saying this, it depends on what you're doing, but it really does, right? So it's usually fairly subtle, but if you start making more extreme moves in your EQ, so for example, with more extreme slopes or more extreme Q values in certain frequency ranges especially, then this can make your EQ less transparent. And this especially happens when things start to affect your transients, right? So I talked about something similar to this in my video on crossfades where I was talking about equal power versus equal gain. But if you have two similar signals and one has been filtered by the EQ, whereas the other has not, then you might have shifts in phase that can cause cancellation, right? And that happens when the two signals are added together, they're summed back together in your mix. That's something that happens. So that's kind of the big use case in my mind for using linear phase is when you have two very similar signals and you're worried about that phase cancellation happening. You want to make sure that that doesn't happen. That's when I would shift into linear phase. So when you shift into linear phase, you have a few different processing resolution options, right? So we have low, medium, high, very high, and then maximum. And so depending on what you're working on and what you're doing, you might want to choose different options here. So basically what Fabfilter recommends is that you only use this low option here with low Q values. And so remember, with Q values, low numbers are wider bandwidths and higher numbers are skinnier bandwidths. And I believe that comes from the electronics world where, if you have a higher Q value, it stood for quality, right? So higher Q values are more thin, so they're more specific. So you have more precision. So that's why they called it quality, even though in the audio world, we don't consider high Q values higher quality, right? It's not like that for us at all. So, but that's where that comes from. And that's a little segue. But anyway, low here, just if you're doing low Q values, so wide bandwidths. They recommend medium for just in general if you're using linear phase processing. This is kind of like the default that they seem to recommend. And then they recommend that you use high if you're using high Q values in the low end of the frequency spectrum. And then as we go higher and higher here, the higher we go, so from low to high, the higher we go, the larger the latency is in terms of samples. So just keep that in mind as we go here. But the very high option here gives you much better resolution at very low frequencies. But it's always a bit of a trade-off, right? So with a lot of these tools, it's you pick and choose based on what you're doing and the trade-off that you want to make. So the trade-off here, according to Fabfilter, is primarily the latency. So with this option, if you're at, for example, 44.1 kilohertz, then your latency is going to be 17,408 samples, which is actually about 395 milliseconds, which doesn't sound like a lot to some people, but for those of us in the audio world, that's a lot. 395 milliseconds is a lot. It's very noticeable. So that's just something to consider when you're piling up your plugins and you're worrying about latency. And then, the same type of consideration has to be made if you want to switch over to maximum. So maximum gives you very high resolution, even at very low frequencies. It's just even better, right? But then it comes with even more latency. And it's to the point where they say you might have pre-echo problems if you switch into maximum. So yeah, that's basically it, the different processing modes in the Fabfilter Pro Q. So to kind of summarize, if you're having phase cancellation issues or if you're worried about phase cancellation issues, then I would probably reach for linear phase. But otherwise, I think zero latency or a natural phase should be adequate. It should be good enough. And, if you've watched my videos or if you've hung out with me while I'm working, you would know that, natural phase is probably the one that I reach for the most personally. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. That's what I tend to reach for the most. One isn't necessarily inherently better than the other, in my opinion. They're just different tools for different problems and different purposes. So do what you will with that information, I guess. But I hope you like this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. I'd appreciate all of that stuff. And I do have a Patreon, so it's patreon.com/CatoNoise. And the big thing I've been focusing on lately is the Discord server where we're hanging out. We're sharing information, sharing stuff, sharing our mixes, just talking about audio and nerding out about audio. It's been a lot of fun. So with that said, I come out with new videos every Wednesday, and thank you so much for hanging out. Okay, let's see. I didn't make a NAMM video, but I have notes from NAMM. Let's see. What's one thing that I learned at NAMM? There's a really good studio design talk at NAMM. I really liked that. One thing that they were talking about that was really interesting is they were talking about having an absorption membrane, a membrane absorber like wood or something, and then an attic-like space above to help with your low end. And I didn't realize this, but my studio has that. So basically I have a ceiling here, but this is a little garage. It's been insulated and everything. I have windows and walls with insulation, but I have a ceiling here, and then there's like a, this kind of space with the roof, and it's all full of insulation. Actually, the whole thing isn't full of insulation, but there's insulation piled up there on top of the ceiling, and then there's like a gap. And I think that might be kind of similar to what they were talking about from my understanding during the talk. And it explains how, my when I run analysis in my studio, it's not too bad, the compensation, if I use something like Sound ID or whatever. It's not too extreme. I've been pretty lucky. But the other cool thing that I thought was really interesting from this talk is they were talking about using things like glass and wood and then making micro perforations into them, so like tiny little holes, right? And how when they do that, they can actually make it behave from an acoustics perspective just like foam. So they can make it absorb just like foam. So they had things like glass panels in some really high-end studios that were actually performing the same function that foam would in the studio, and I thought that was so cool. Just, like, so flippin' cool, and I don't even wanna know how much it costs. I'm sure it's insane. So, anyway. Anyway, I'll put some more thoughts in my next video, I'm sure. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll talk to you soon.